It's a great privilege today to be introducing Anne McMahon, who has written a really fabulous book called Floating Prisons, Irish Convict Hulks and Voyages to New South Wales 1823 to 1837. And Anne has already written extensively about convict transportation to Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land. She is a graduate of the University of Tasmania and ANU, and her academic career was at the University of Canberra. And today we're going to learn about something which I think has slipped a little bit from some of our knowledge of history, but in the transportation system. We're going to hear about two significant prison hulks in Ireland. The first is the Surprise, which was moored in Cork Harbour, and the second is the Essex, which was moored in the Dublin Refuge Harbour. And I must say that I found this particularly useful in doing my own family history. And I think that we're going to have great fun today learning about the two hulks and putting into context the 12,000 men and boy prisoners from those hulks who were transported to Sydney. And I would like now to introduce Anne. Over to you.
Thank you, Christine. First of all, I really need to say that there were significant differences in values between the Irish and the English during this period. The Irish thought of themselves as a kingdom. The English thought of them as a dependency. The Irish thought of time as timeless, and their sense of justice stretched really right back to Cromwell, but in the immediate sense to the Act of Union. And then finally, Ireland had a communal sense of land, whereas England had a concept of private ownership. So these were three main differences between these two countries. And of course, England had compromised its justice system by the introduction of the Insurrection Act. These were the differences that in fact were manifest in eviction, rent increases, conversion of commonage to pasture. And the result of this, with the increase in transportation, was that women had lost their partners in marriage, they'd lost their dowry, they'd lost their household duties, and they were forced to immigrate, which was taken up by the immigration commissioners later on. Now, in all of this disturbance, the Irish were affected by three secret societies. The White Boys, the earliest one, established in 1761, was concerned with protecting the communal concept of land, and hence their involvement in eviction, in increases in rents, and of course in the tithes, which featured strongly later. And in the midst of all this, you had the ribbonmen who were opposed to the Orange Order, and then the Rockites, which was the most recent secret society, and it was established through a dispute about rent in the estate of Lord Courtenay. And even though Courtenay had granted an abatement to the tenants, and so the original Rockite had many different guises, really. He appeared in so many different forms. And in the midst of all this, you had Pastorini's prophecies, which were developed by an English clergyman based on the book of Revelation. And these predicted that the extermination of all Protestants from Ireland, and the date was set for 1825. So this caused a great deal of excitement among the labouring classes. It was widely believed and widely feared. Now, in the disturbance that occurred, there was really quite a strong element of repression, partly because Ireland at the time was a Catholic country and it had a sense of timeless justice. And this was really fostered by the resentment which they felt about the failure of Catholic emancipation, which had been promised as part of the Act of Union. Now, under O'Connell, the Catholic Association was then established in 1823, and the clergy assisted in its development, and the association developed a war chest of £10,000, which greatly frightened the English administration, which existed in Ireland, of course. So the alarm about that, well, they attempted to guard the streets of Dublin, and battalions of troops were assembled on the foreshore. And the result of all this was greatly increasing pressure on the jail system. And the jails were underfunded and they were quite insecure. And so what happened was transportation with the idea of holding the prisoners in hulks was seen as a solution, and it was adopted enthusiastically by William Gregory and Edward Trevor. Here you see the Dublin refuge harbour with the demasted Essex sitting there, and you see the contrast between the free citizens speaking to each other, and here 300 men locked in the hold of the Essex hulk. This is rather faint, but it's very significant, really, because it is the only drawing of the surprise hulk. And here you see the numbering system, number 10, 11 and 12. 10 is the guard ship called the Semiramis, which was commanded by Lord Colville. 11, next to Haulbowline Island, was the Surprise, which had just arrived. It had just been navigated across from Plymouth, and it had not yet been demasted. And then number 12 is the Trent, which is, it served as a hospital ship, but it was in a rather dilapidated state. So that's the setting in Cork Harbour of the Surprise, the first hulk to arrive. Now, the players in all of this activity were, first of all, William Gregory, and Gregory was the Under-Secretary in Dublin Castle. He was violently anti-Catholic. He was a dedicated Tory. He was ready to betray anyone whose trust he gained, and he was a spy. So this is Gregory, who was the most significant public official in Ireland at the time, because the Lord Lieutenants and the Chief Secretaries were, of course, members of the British Parliament. And so what Gregory did was use his spies to get the press on side, and he had control of the Secret Service Fund, which he used very extensively in securing support for his views. Now, in 1830, Gregory was dismissed. He was dismissed by Lord Anglesey in Anglesey's second term in in office. And this was post the gaining of Catholic emancipation, but Anglesey was very hostile toward Gregory, and so was O'Connell, of course, but they had to wait quite a long time to achieve their aims. And so Anglesey saw him as a spy. He saw him as a person who violated the trust of anyone whose trust he gained. And then the second person in this whole scenario was a man called Edward Trevor. And Trevor was also violently anti-Catholic. He, in his membership of the Guild of St. Luke, he had taken oaths against Catholicism and against the detail of Catholic ceremonies. He was trained or self-taught really as an apothecary, and he named himself superintendent and medical inspector of the convict hulks when they were established. And his task was to supervise the embarkation of all the convicts. Now, remember that the sentence of transportation of a convict did not commence until they embarked. And so many of these men, in fact, had been kept back in Ireland, for some of them for some years, really, in the local prisons, and then in Kilmainham jail, and then stuck on board the hulks. And so Trevor then had the support of the prison inspectors. There were two of these men, James Palmer and Benjamin Woodward. And in their annual reports on the hulks, Trevor's work was praised every year. Now, who were these prisoners then? Well, the crimes of most of the prisoners were, of course, for theft. Theft included felony, cattle and sheep stealing, administering oaths, house robbery, highway robbery, picking pockets, and so on, including military desertion, who were also carried on the voyages of the hulks. And then up to 1835, both these hulks had between them 411 prisoners who'd been convicted of murder or manslaughter. Now, their particular targets were, of course, magistrates, including Magistrate Going, who was murdered in 1835. So they were the men who were being deported, really, from Ireland. The actual hulks, let's just look at those for a moment. There were two of the hulks, both of which were navigated across from England. And in both of them, the masts were removed, and these very high bulwarks were added so that they were not able to see over the edge of the bulwarks, and mostly they were prohibited from climbing them. And the surprise then, as I've shown, was the first arrival, and it had been a decommissioned British warship built over 2 years, ending in 1812. It was the larger hulk because the transportation had previously always occurred from Cork, because Dublin Harbour was thought of as the most dangerous harbour in the world, and therefore it was avoided. And what happened was the prisoners from Dublin and the north and the east coast were all sent round the east coast of Ireland to be held in Cork County Jail or Cork City Jail before transportation. So it was the larger hulk, the surprise. and it had been built as a 38-gun frigate, really. And then the second hulk was the Essex, which was an American ship built by public subscription in Salem, Massachusetts. And it had been captured by the British Navy during the War of 1812 at Chile, and it accommodated 300 men and boys. So that was the lesser hulk. Now, another picture of the Dublin Refuge Harbour. As I said, it was the most dangerous harbour in the world because gales swept across from east to west, and the sailing ships were driven on land, and the sailors and passengers on board were of course drowned. So for many years there'd been agitation to obtain a more tranquil harbour. So that's where the Essex was moored, and then to look at the conditions on both these hulks that had now been set up. The people led by Trevor were sycophantic and corrupt. On board the hulks, there was no work was organised, no schooling was organised. This was very different to the hulks in England. Food was 2 meals a day at threepence, at a value of 3 pence per day. The clothing that the men were supplied with was fustian cloth, which was a cross between wool and cotton. And then this was further reduced with Trevor making savings, who eliminated their socks and their underpants. And so in the southern latitudes, they were freezing, really. The savings that he made were through inadequate medical treatment, through inadequate clothing, through inadequate diet, and through inadequate funeral costs of men who died on board the hulks. Now, the prisoners were desperate for transportation. I've said there they looked forward to it. It was more than that. They were really desperate. And just looking at their reaction, this was violence on board the hulks. And here, what happened, there were these various factions on both of the hulks, the Cork boys, the Dublin boys, the North boys, and no one dared to enter the prison in the evening. In both the hulks, the boys were held with men because there was no difference in law between the parties. But the stronger men preyed on the weak men, stealing their rations, which of course were scanty. And the result was a great many injuries and chest, of eye and kidney damage. So that's the scene on board the hulks, really. And now we want to look at the fact that the prisoners were so desperate to leave, there were escapes from both of the hulks. The first escape was from the Surprise, and this man, Thomas Reardon, he had his leg irons removed. Remember that on board the hulks, all the men wore leg irons, which of course are varying weights, and depending on how sick they were, whether there was 1 or 2 leg irons held. But anyway, Reardon had ulcerated legs. The guard took his irons off. A storm came on, and Reardon climbed the bulwark and jumped into Cork Harbour, but was captured. Then poor Edward Neve was desperate to go on to be selected on the Portland in 1833, And he said that if he wasn't selected, he would do himself in. And so that night that the Portland was sitting in the harbour at Cork, there were cries from the water heard by a guard on Haulbowline Island, and his body was not found. Then there's a third escape, and there were others which I haven't actually been able to track, but this man, Brown, he simply rowed away from the surprise. He stole the boat because the keeper had come back drunk, so that enabled Brown to steal the boat. He was then captured and transported on the Eliza after that. So they were some of the escapes. In addition, there were other escapes from the Essex. There were 3 prisoners who attempted to escape, who were said to be trying to organise a protest march in Dublin, and 2 were shot, and the third man was assumed to be drowned. And then this additional person, also caused by the fact that the keeper went away and was drunk, he was able to escape but was recaptured and subsequently transported. So these were the desperate men trying to get off these hulks. Now, in addition, we had attempts to set alight to the hulks. And so the prisoners set alight to both the hulks to reveal their plight, but also to get off the hulks. And in relation to the surprise, when they made the 2 attempts to burn the hulk in 1835, which 49 men had secured themselves down the gangplank and set alight to the ladders to the gangplank. And at the time, the prison inspector was a man called Samuel Hollingsworth, and Hollingsworth came on board. Meanwhile, with the prisoners down the gangplank, one of the privates had started firing into the prisoners, and when Hollingworth came on board, he said that if there was any more the disturbance, they were to open the guards and fire away. And there was a subsequent inquiry from that by Major Arbuthnot and also Major Trevor, who was Trevor's son. And they said this was not in any military manual that the guards could open fire on the prisoners. But of course, there have been a number of instances where they in fact did just that. Now, in relation to the arson on the hulks, the more serious attempt was made against the Essex in 1830 when they were just trying to embark prisoners on the Hercules. And so the prisoners saw this as an opportunity to in the disturbance to get out. And there were 2 other vessels in the refuge harbour, and they came to the aid of the stricken vessel. So that was the more serious attempt to set fire to the hulks. Now, just giving you another picture, this is the Semiramis. This is the guard ship that was commanded by Lord Colville, which was something of an overkill, really, that they had to have a vice admiral in Cork Harbour guarding the Essex, but he didn't last that long. Now, the voyages themselves, we need to really look at that. There were 61 of these voyages, and during the 61, they transported 11,900 men to Sydney. And at the embarkations, there was a great deal of argument, especially from the experienced surgeons who did not want to take grievously ill prisoners on the voyages, but Trevor was determined to take all the prisoners who had been selected to embark. So the pair argued, but Trevor had the final say, really, because the Lord Lieutenant simply accepted his views. But the point about this was that the surgeons received a bounty for the arrival of healthy prisoners at their destination. And sometimes that really simply consisted of dragging the men up to the barracks in Sydney. Here's just an example of one of the ships. This was a ship, not a bark. There were a number of barks that were actually involved in these voyages, but the Bussorah merchant made 2 voyages during with prisoners from the hulks. Looking at the voyages themselves, it's interesting to look at the medical treatments that were used. Each ship carried a surgeon superintendent, but at the time, we're talking about the 1825 to 30, the anatomy was not part of their medical training. The focus was on bodily fluids, that they were the source of disease at the time. And as part of the issue for the voyage, the medicines were issued as stated there, 50 adults based on a voyage of 140 days, which was much longer than they normally took. They included Epsom salts, the largest quantity, linseed oil, castor oil, and of course mercury in the form of the famous blue pill. And mercury, of course, is now regarded as toxic, but at the time it was an essential treatment. The actual medical treatments on the voyage then consisted predominantly of bloodletting. As Surgeon McTurnell said, we naval surgeons can do little without the lancet, but the surgeon on board the Ferguson, he found that even taking a few ounces of blood caused the prisoners to faint. And on the voyages, the main causes of death were dysentery because of the fouling of the prisons, in particular, consumption or tuberculosis, as it was called, diarrhea, and scurvy. In addition, scurvy, although Captain Cook had used sauerkraut, and I was very surprised when I found these men didn't know anything about sauerkraut. They really knew very little about scurvy, but they did know that vegetables and fruit assisted. And so if they called at Simon's Bay on the journey, then their prisoners were more likely to survive in a healthy way. But because the focus was on bodily fluids, not on anatomy, and remember that the medical practitioners were exhuming the corpses at the time to try and understand the nature of anatomy, the surgeons kept speaking about these depressing passions. And for a time I was puzzled about this, but what it turned out, it was a clinical judgment in which they were describing the repression of perspiration. That is, depressed people were not perspiring, but the bodily fluids then settled in the lungs. and they became toxic and were related to various types of diseases, really. So that was the state of medical knowledge really at the time. Now, just really looking at the overall picture, the attempt by England to absorb Ireland as a dependency was characterised by prejudice, criticism, disdain, patronage, and the Irish response was often violent. In fact, violence was thought of as a way of life in Ireland. But what Trevor and Gregory did was quadruple the transportation of the troublemakers. The men who were on board the hulks were predominantly young men. They were predominantly under 30 years of age. And so they were got rid of from the country and sent to Sydney, which at the time in the 1828 census had only a population of 36,500. So having the arrival of roughly 1,200 Irish men, predominantly Catholic, into the colony at the time was a major impact because it changed both the sex composition of the population and, of course, the religious composition of the population. And so that was the impact, which they then had to distribute these men to various, the ones who committed serious crimes to places like Norfolk Island, to Macquarie Harbour, to Newcastle and to Moreton Bay. And this was the situation in which was faced by the Whig government in 1835 when Lord Melbourne took the British government, and Thomas Drummond became the Under-Secretary. Now, Drummond was a Scottish engineer, and he had been a member of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, which was aiming to regulate the taxation of the various counties in Ireland. And he loved Ireland, and he immediately set to work to interrogate Trevor, and he really disposed of Trevor by death by 1,000 cuts, by cutting his allowance to Cork, by questioning his payments that Trevor had obtained for his role in the execution of Robert Emmet, and of the pension which he'd gained, whether he went to Cork or not. And so he then questioned Trevor, but before he was able to find out whether Trevor still received his pension from the Robert Emmet involvement, Trevor actually died in office in 1837. So that was the end of Trevor. And of course, meanwhile, Gregory had been dismissed in the second term of Anglesey, so he was out of the system as well. So that's really where it stood in 1837. Now, this is just a finale. When I went to Ireland, to Dublin, I visited Kilmainham Jail, of course, and I was on a long line of a whole 2 blocks away, and there were actually no English voices that I heard in the queue. They were all German, French, Spanish, Italian. And when we got to the gate, this was the demons of crime above the gateway there, shown with the chains of justice. And so that's the opening, which I'd recommend anyone going to Ireland must go to Kilmainham. So that's really where it ends for the present.